Hey, what's up, everyone? So today, again, it's going to be a viewer's request. We're going to work with APIs. So there's an API out there which is free to use, and I use it a lot for testing. And we're going to work with the Microsoft Graph API as well. We are going to get this information from this Ninja API, and then we are going to create an item in SharePoint Online with the Graph API. Everything in Power Automate Desktop. Now, forget about the weather forecast or the exchange rate or anything like that. We're going to work with something that I find more interesting, which is a dog API. Why? Because I love dogs. So why not? Sky, come on. Come on. Come here. Good girl. Good girl. First, let me show you the API we are going to work with. If you open your browser and we type Ninja API, then we have API Ninjas. And despite the fact that they have a premium plan, they have a free plan. And this is actually good for testing because you can have up to 10,000 calls per month. And they have dozens and dozens and dozens of APIs. So if we click on API, you can see that they have a lot that you can actually use for testing. And the one we're going to use today is the Dogs API. So if I click in here, this API is going to give us the name that we can see here, which is the dog's breed. Then some information about the dogs itself. And if we continue to scroll down, we have the API key, which is required. And below, this is the data that we're going to have. So depending on the breed, the information will be the same, but the data will be different. And if we continue to scroll down, they give us some examples for different languages. And if I choose JavaScript, for example, I can see the way I need to format my API when I send it via Power Automate Desktop. And I also see the way I need to construct the URL to be able to get the data in return. Now, let's jump into Power Automate Desktop and start building the first part of our bot. My API key, I've set it in a notepad on my machine, which is not secure. But there's a point to this. I want to show you something that is going to be okay in some cases, but most of the time not in production. I'm going to look for an action which is called read from text file. I'm going to look for my file path. I'm going to store the content as a single value because this is basically just one line the way we've seen it. I will leave the encoding as the default, but I'm going to change the variable. And I'm going to call this API key headers. Now I want people to type the dog's breed. Let's look for the display input dialog. We're going to put a title. Then the message we're going to present to the users. Please enter a dog breed. There's no default value. The input type is just a single line, and we're going to change the variables. First, the user input. I'm going to change that to user dog name. And then the button press, I actually do not need that. So good practice is when you don't need a variable that is produced, you can just disable it. Next, this is when we need to call our API. So we are going to use the invoke web service. And what is going to be the URL? Let's go back to the documentation for a second, and we can see the URL that we need. And at the end, we need to add the input from the user. And the input from the user is coming from our display input dialog. So if we go into the variables, we have the user dog name. The method is going to be the get method, and the accept and content type, we want that in JSON. The headers, we've seen that this is where we are going to send our API key. Click on variables, and we have our API key headers. We don't need to have anything in the request body for our case, and we're going to save the response into the variables that we see at the bottom. But if we click on advanced, we're going to need to toggle that off, follow redirection, and encode the request body. Then we can leave the rest as the default and click on save. Although now thinking ahead, because we're going to have the second part where we're also going to use the invoke web service, I'm going to change the variable names. And I'm just going to add dog at the end of those three. Now, we can test our bot right now. And remember when I said that this was not a very good idea to actually have your API key or any of your secrets, your passwords or anything else, even coming from an external file. So let's run the flow and you will see why. And here is the reason why. If you look at the variables values, you can see that your API key is actually exposed. You don't see it completely in here, but let's say you're in an office and you have loads of people just walking past you or coming to your desk or anything like that. You would not want people looking at your screen and see your passwords or anything that could be secret. And also, if you leave it like that, it would actually be written in the logs. And you do not want that either. One way that we can counter this is if you go on the right-hand side of your API key, then you will see there's this little icon to mark as sensitive. If I select this, it's going to say sensitive value, and we're not going to see it. And it will also not be written in the logs when you run your bots. So it might be okay for demo purposes like I'm doing right now, or if you have any sort of testing, but this is not the way it should be done for production. But this is a video for another day and I will have a video just for that. But for now, let's keep it this way. Let's have a look at the response that we got. And this is, as you can see here, this is text value. And we have all the information we've seen on the documentation. To work with this, we are going to convert that into JSON. And if I expand this, there is an action which is convert JSON to custom object. And the value for this, if we look into our variables, this is the web service response dog. And let's rename the variable as well. And click on save. Now let's run again. Now you can see that the API is not shown anymore. And looking at the JSON variable, if we click on more, we have all the properties that the documentation mentioned. That's great. Now we've finished our first part, which is getting the data. Let's make our flow just a little bit clearer. We're going to use regions. And I'm going to drag this at the very top, put a name for the region. And then I'm going to drag all our actions into the region. And regions are, like in PowerShell, for example, they are literally just a block to organize your flow or your scripting. And just for simplicity, because we're going to run the flow several times now, I'm going to disable this action because I do not want to be prompt anymore. And I'm going to change the URL to include directly the value that we want. This time I'm going to change and I'm going to put German Shepherd. Why? Because that's my dog. I love German Shepherd, so why not? Now that we're going to work on the second part, we're going to upload some of the data into SharePoint Online. And for that, we're going to use the SharePoint Graph API. I've already created my app registration in Azure. And now in the bot, I'm going to need a couple of things. I'm going to need my tenant ID. I'm going to need my client ID and my client secret. And also where I want to create this item, meaning it's going to be in a specific list on a specific site. So let me show you where we are going to upload this. My site is the RPA and DPA site, and I have a list which is called Dog API. Now, I've set all my variables. I've marked them as sensitive, and each of those values, when you enter them, do not put any single quotes or double quotes, just the bare value. Actually, let me just show you one. So the tenant ID, for example, this is literally just the value. There's no single quotes or double quotes. And now it's time to call the API. So again, we're going to use the invoke web service. And the URL to call for the SharePoint Graph API is this one. https://login.microsoftonline.com / then the tenant ID, which is our variable, then OAuth 2 v2.0 / token. Everything should be documented in your API documentation, even if it's not the Graph API. The method this time is going to be post. Again, for the accept, we're going to put JSON, but the content type is going to be different. And again, everything should be in the documentation. This is not something you can just guess. So for that specific case, it's going to be x-www-form-url encoded. We're not going to put anything for the custom headers. However, because we're using, in my case, client ID and client secret, for the request body, it's going to be specific to this case. And if you are in the same case, this is exactly the way you should write it. For the grant type, you have to type client_credentials. Then we have the client ID, which is the variable client ID. The scope is the Microsoft Graph. And then our client secret. Again, we're going to save the response into the variables, but we also need to go into the advanced parameters and disable the encode request body. If I continue to scroll down, I'm going to rename the headers and simply add token at the end. And before running the flow, let's also add the JSON as custom object action. So when we run the flow, we can see all the values that we are going to work with. Let's go back to JSON and convert JSON to a custom object. And the JSON, if we go into variables, scroll down a bit, and we have the web service response token. And I'm going to rename that as well to token. And now we can run the flow. Let me save it first and run. And now that we've been able to connect successfully, we need to create our item in SharePoint. Let me put a comment quickly. And again, we're going to need to invoke the web service. This time the URL is going to be just a little bit different because now we need to interact with the endpoints. And the way we create an item in SharePoint with the graph, we use the graph.microsoft.com. I'm using the version 1.0, not the beta one. Then we have sites, we have our site ID, lists, the list ID, and finally the items. The method is going to be post, and this time everything is just going to be JSON. Now we're going to need to enter something in the headers and the body. For the headers, we're going to need some authorization. So let's go into the Microsoft documentation. And we can see that the way we are going to authorize the creation of that item, we need a bearer and the token. And we had this information when we connected. Let me just close this. And I'm going to save it. And we had this information when we used the first invoke web service, when we're connected with the token. And looking at the value for the variable, if I just hover over that, we have the bearer, which is the token type. And if I double click on it and scroll down, we also have the access token. Let's go back into our invoke web service. And the headers, this is going to be authorization column and then our variable dot token type space. And again, the variable token dot access token. Now for the request body, the way we are going to construct that, we need to have the fields and then each of the columns where we want to enter data. So title is going to be the dog's name, which is literally the dog's breed. And then we're just going to choose if the dog is good with children and is good with other dogs. This is coming from the JSON as custom object dog variable. And then the property is going to be either name, good with children, or good with other dogs. I'm going to copy this and put that in the request body. Save the response is going to be the same as usual. And again, we're going to go to the advanced and then toggle that off and rename the variables. This time, I'm just going to say upload. And now we should be good to go. So I'm going to save the flow and I'm going to run it and open the browser as well at the same time so we can see if the item has been created. I'm going to refresh, not even needed. And now we have the item that has been created. We have the dog's breed, which is the name of the dog, if they are good with children and good with other dogs. Okay, so we don't even need to actually put a convert JSON to custom object at the end because unless you want to do something with this data, but for now, this is all we needed to do. So I hope this video helped you and I'll see you in the next one.